this panel. So this panel is one of the most important panels we need to deal with. In 2016, the then governor said that la deuda es impagable, and that's when the process of enacting PROMESA started. PROMESA has not gone without conflicts. There are many views on the issue. There are many views on how the debt should be addressed. And I am extremely excited and privileged to be moderating this panel with such esteemed folks like Federico de Jesús, founder and principal of FDJ Solutions, Myrna Rivera, founder and senior advisor of Consultiva de Puerto Rico, and Javier Balmaceda from the Centro, I always get it wrong, from the Centro on Budget and Policy Priorities, CBPP. So the topic of debt is not a new one also to the summit. Last year we had a whole day dedicated to debt. We had a movie called Bancarrota. If you have not watched it, please do. It gives you a great overview in a visual way of how we got to where we are on debt. She stars on that picture, on that movie.
Is it a movie or a documentary?
It's a documentary. It is not on Netflix, it's on Vimeo. But maybe we should talk to the producers. He was here last year on the panel, and we spent a whole day, a whole hour, talking about how we got here. We also were joined by Dr. Marieli, who is an expert on Fiscal Oversight Board. So she's not part of this panel this year, but almost everything I know about Fiscal Oversight Board comes from her. It was a great panel because it set the basis for what we're going to be discussing today. We're not going to discuss in detail what kind of debts we have and how many. We want to focus more on the policy side and what's currently happening. We know that Fiscal Oversight Boards are not a new thing. We know that Fiscal Oversight Boards are not unique to Puerto Rico. If you ever hear that, oh, that Fiscal Oversight Board that we have is because we're not fill in the blank and insert your political view on the status of here, that is not necessarily true. Because there have been over 100 Fiscal Oversight Boards, and right here, the District of Columbia at some point had a Fiscal Oversight Board. But it does affect us. We're not going to negate that fact. And that's what we're here to discuss. My first question is to Fede as a political analyst is, how do we end up with PROMESA? What would we say about the political climate that happened when PROMESA was enacted?
So, well, I guess the microphone didn't work. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Edwin and Centro, the PW, the Elias School, and our fellow panelists, and all of you for being here in the panel before lunch, so not an unenviable position to be in. So how do we get to PROMESA? I think that to understand how we got to the day when Alejandro Garcia Padilla said that the debt was unpayable, really, we need to start with the United States Congress. In 1976, in the middle of in the aftermath of the oil crisis here in the United States that obviously affected Puerto Rico, which had been investing in petrochemicals in the island that actually didn't go anywhere. Congress approved tax incentives to further enhance Puerto Rico's economic development, which is called Section 936, which was responsible for more than 300,000 direct and indirect jobs in Puerto Rico. There was a requirement that 936 companies, which were mostly U.S. manufacturing companies that got a tax credit from Uncle Sam to invest in Puerto Rico and the territories, there was a requirement that they deposit some of their earnings for an extended period of time in Puerto Rico's banks. So that provided liquidity to the economy. You could argue that Puerto Rico depended too heavily on these tax incentives, that when NAFTA was created in 1993, subsequently other trade agreements in the region took away Puerto Rico's competitive advantage of having a unique access to the U.S. market. But be that as it may, after Congress eliminated those tax incentives, many of those companies left, more than 100,000 jobs were lost, and those deposits that were in the banks created a liquidity crunch that the government decided to overcome, not by spending less or looking for other economic development tools, but basically just by taking out a credit card to pay for all their credit card debts, and then when that didn't work, taking out 17 other types of credit cards to pay all their credit cards, which is basically Puerto Rico's financial mess as we know it today. This was also an issue when in 1984 Strom Thurmond mysteriously took away Puerto Rico's right to declare bankruptcy under Chapter 9. And to go back to your question, the political climate in 2015, 2016 was such that the Republicans controlled Congress. Some bondholders opposed Chapter 9. Basically, they were opposed to tinkering with the bankruptcy code. And really, you had a fight between bondholders. So this narrative that PROMESA was the people versus the powerful Wall Street, it was really an inter-fight between Wall Street, and the people were stuck in the middle and are still stuck in the middle. You had COFINA bondholders that were in favor of Chapter 9, because that meant that the general obligation bondholders would also get a cut. But then the general obligation bondholders were against PROMESA because it took away their piece of the pie and their priority as a constitutional debt. So the result was the Republicans controlled Congress. President Obama did a compromise that resulted in PROMESA. I argued at the time that the president had authority under executive action to do more. The bonds in New York City, you mentioned other control boards. In the 1970s, Uncle Sam basically bailed out New York City and bought some of their bonds. In the 90s, President Clinton actually provided Mexico liquidity during the peso crisis. And in fact, a week after PROMESA was passed, which created the Financial Control Board and a debt restructuring mechanism along with a stay to stop creditors from basically raiding the Treasury of Puerto Rico, the United States guaranteed $1 billion in loans to the country of Tunisia. And then to say that they had their hands tied in the case of Puerto Rico, when they had actually passed a law predicated on Article 4 of the Constitution, which is the territorial clause that says basically that they can do pretty much what they want with Puerto Rico, is really contradictory, and it really demonstrated the lack of willingness by the Obama administration to do what it could. And obviously the insistence by the Republicans in Congress to condition the stay in the restructuring to a financial control board, which really didn't address what the United States Congress and Puerto Rico has neglected, which is how do we create jobs so that we can grow our way out of this debt crisis, especially after the hurricane, when the control board basically said, we're going to pay off more of the debt. And like Edwin showed in that graph, after the hurricane, their own projections are that Puerto Rico really will not grow its economy. And PROMESA did not provide any economic development tools for the island. So all of this debate is really interesting, but we're not going to change the equation unless Congress provides Puerto Rico economic tools. And you could argue, well, why are you so dependent on the U.S. Congress? Well, Puerto Rico had the ability to declare bankruptcy, to have its own monetary policy and other economic levers that it doesn't have access to. Then we could have a conversation. A lot of people can extend this conversation to other policies like the Jones Act or tax incentives, but whatever mechanism we can put together to create, that's what we need to diversify our economy and grow our way out of the debt. So I hope that I answered your question in a non-complicated way.
I think it was fantastic. Don't you think it was fantastic? We have the issue of the debt is very complicated. We have many sides. We have the political side. We also have the sides of the bondholders, and we also have the side of the people of Puerto Rico. Myrna, you, through Consultiva, you represent bondholders, many of which are Puerto Ricans. So for us to come and try to separate, well, those are the bondholders, we got to understand that they're not all non-Puerto Ricans, so they're not a foreign entity. Myrna, can you give us a brief background on the debt and what it actually means from the bondholding side?
Buenos dias, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations for taking the time to sit here and have this conversation. It's hugely important. I have to preface my comments by stating that they are not necessarily representative of the shareholders or the employees or the clients of Consultiva Wealth Management. Having said that, I've been an investment advisor in Puerto Rico for over 38 years. And there's a dimension to this story that's unquantifiable. And it's the pain and the anguish of families in Puerto Rico who bought Puerto Rico bonds and who in the process have lost 3 generations of work and legacy of their families. I have spent the lion's share of the last 5 years This started in July of 2013. So is that 5 years? That's 6 years, actually. With a box of Kleenex on the conference room table, receiving families and helping guide them to figure out how to restructure and what possibilities they have, not necessarily of recuperating, but certainly of redefining their lives based on this tragedy. This is a tragedy that has the proportions of Maria, and then some. In 2012, Puerto Rico bondholders, Puerto Ricans, owned about $35 billion in debt. And this, if any of you, los académicos who would like to take a look at this, go to the website of the Oficina del Comisionado de Instituciones Financieras, OSIF, and you will see tables that go back to 2011, some go back as far as 2009, and they tell you how much money was deposited at the brokerage firms in Puerto Rico and how much money was deposited in investment companies in Puerto Rico. It's about 35 billion. It peaked in 2012, and in 2013 it goes to 28 billion. So there's a wipeout of $7 billion. Now think about this. This is our parents, our tíos, our tías, our brothers and sisters, and our neighbors. This is not planet Jupiter. This is us, $7 billion worth of our collective assets disappeared in 12 months. And people literally were breathless. So the question was, what happened between 2012 and 13 that made that happen? And since then, it's been about restructuring. Between 13 and 14, it remained at about 28 billion. And then a lot of those bonds have moved from Puerto Rico owners to the institutional players who showed up around 2014, 2015. I started getting knocks on my door from hedge funds from the US, who are beginning to focus on Puerto Rico and trying to figure out what's going on. And they are risk investors, and they want to understand the risk and quantify the risk to make a determination as to whether they would be investors. On the other side, basically in July of 2013, Detroit declared bankruptcy. And a month later, Barron's, front page, who's next? And they focus on Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico had sort of a Harry Potter shawl on us. You know, nobody saw us, we were invisible, and then we're not invisible anymore in August of 2013. And between August and September of 2013, that $7 billion drop happened between August and September, in 30 días. And so we start getting people calling us up who have friends, who have family. They've got their accounting, they've got their statement, their custody statement, their September custody statement, and they don't understand. Something's happened and they don't understand, and the broker's not answering questions, and so we start getting the questions. That's a story that we can go on for a very long time. It's about leverage. Most of the money that Puerto Ricans invested in Puerto Rico bonds was not because you bought the COFINA bond or you bought the GO. You bought a mutual fund that was constructed largely by UBS. They were constructed by Popular Securities. They were constructed by UBS and Santander Asset Management. But the lion's share was in mutual funds constructed by UBS. At the end of this crisis, there were about 23 mutual funds at UBS, and they all bought Puerto Rico bonds. And so the deal was you, as an investor, could have a diversified portfolio of tax-free income and inheritance tax-free income. Now, please make a note of this. This is something that most of us do not know. Those of us born in Puerto Rico are US citizens in a foreign country, to the eyes of the IRS. And so if you have assets, you were born in the United States, and thank you to the new tax amendments that just went through back in the end of 2017 under the Trump administration, you can hold up to $11 million in assets, and when you die, your heirs don't pay estate transfer tax. They only begin to pay estate transfer tax after $11 million in assets. Now, I don't know very many people who are in that category, but that's the fact. But if you were born in Puerto Rico, and you live in Puerto Rico, and you die in Puerto Rico, and you have US assets, you have an apartment in Orlando, you have mutual funds with your Schwab account and your Fidelity account, you have an IRA because you worked in New York for a long time, whatever it is that you have of assets that are domiciled in the United States, your exemption, your heirs exemption is the first $60,000. And then it goes to 25, 35, 40% estate transfer tax because we are considered under the IRS, under the IRC, non-resident aliens. Check that out, okay? So one would have to ask, why were the Puerto Ricans leaving all their money in Puerto Rico?
You're talking about the estates, not
The estate. So if I was born in Puerto Rico and I die in Puerto Rico, and I have many clients who were born in Puerto Rico, made their professions, came to the U.S., have 401k plans in the U.S., they have IRAs in the U.S., then they go back to Puerto Rico, and nobody told them that now all of those assets are subject to federal estate transfer tax. So when they pass, their children have to pay the tax before they get the inheritance. So you better have liquidity to be able to do that. So the way to get around all of this was let's create investment companies in Puerto Rico, which is largely authored, according to the street, by UBS. Let's create investment companies, which are mutual funds. Mutual funds are called investment companies. So let's create a Puerto Rico law for investment companies, where Puerto Rico, we can buy in these investment companies anything we want. We can buy stocks, bonds, we can buy REITs, we can buy anything we want. But since you are in Puerto Rico, and you bought shares of this fund that's domiciled in Puerto Rico, it's a Puerto Rico asset. So when you die, there's no estate transfer tax, okay? Because in Puerto Rico, the estate transfer tax was eliminated in the 1980s. That created a huge concentration of Puerto Rico bonds, Puerto Rico bank stocks, which is, by the way, chapter 1, the Puerto Rico bond story is chapter 4 of the loss of the money of 4 generations. So you bought, a typical Puerto Rico portfolio in 2012 had Puerto Rico Banco Popular, First Bank, FG, because it was a diversified portfolio. And then they had these mutual funds that had in them the GEOs, the PREPAs, the COFINAs, and so the Puerto Rico investor had all of them in their portfolios. And to boot, and I'll leave it here, they were levered, which meant that if you sat with a broker and you had $100,000 to invest and you put it in one of these funds, the fund turned around and bought $200,000 in bonds. So you didn't know that you were levered 2 to 1. So what happens in the summer of 2013? The bonds begin to drop. It happens in Detroit, and then it's Barron's, and then the bonds begin to drop. And once the bonds dropped to 25%, the mutual funds dropped 50%. Once the bonds dropped 50%, the mutual funds basically were wiped out. So you're sitting here, now this was your money that you got from Asociación de Empleados de Lela because you were a public servant and you retired and you got a check for $30,000 of all the money that Aela saved up for you, and then you sold your house to ¿cómo se dice? You were empty nesting, so you're downsizing, y coges los chavitos of your house, and you ask your accountant, what do I do with the money? And they said, well, you can get tax-free, da-da-da-da-da, and you can imagine the pitch. That's the money that got lost here. It's not just the Puerto Rican elites. It's the money of the people of Puerto Rico, 3 generations that got wiped out.
Thank you, Myrna. I wanted to bring Myrna to bring this perspective, because sometimes we lose perspective of actually who's were the owners of the bonds. We didn't get into this, probably we'll get into it a little bit later. It is important to know that when we hear the term vulture funds, some of these people, they have to sell those bonds at a loss, meaning they have to get rid of them, they no longer have them in their portfolio, and then someone else buys them. So even if that bond appreciates, now they're not participating from that appreciation.
And I mean, one of the things that happened between September and October, and I remember getting the phone call, you had a Puerto Rico bond in your portfolio, and you could borrow against that bond to buy more bonds or to take the money to fix your house. You could, what's called margin. So you had a credit line against your bonds. Your bonds served as collateral. And one day, the brokerage firms in the United States, who not understanding what's going on in Puerto Rico, they take the margin away. So I remember getting the phone call from Wells Fargo and saying, the Puerto Rico bonds are no longer marginable. So your clients who have credit ¿verdad? Who have a debt against your bond. They have 30 days to pay, or we're going to liquidate the bonds. So these sales that we see between August, September, October 2013 are not because the Puerto Ricans want to get out. The U.S. thought that Puerto Ricans are selling. No, they were forced sales. They were forced sales. So by the time the dust settled, some of the brokerage firms have provided credit to themselves to buy some of these bonds, but then that credit got sucked up and got dried up. So it gets to a point, and that's where the vultures step, or what we call the vultures. These are distressed debt specialists. These are funds that are specialized in distressed securities, whether it's real estate, equity, fixed income, whatever it is. It's legit, it's not illegal. We can discuss from here to Timbuktu if it's ethical and moral or not, but the point of the matter is that they're a fundamental force in the market. Think about it, had they not stepped in, where would the bonds have gone in price? Somebody stepped in and created what's called a secondary market. And it wasn't because my uncle and my mother were selling their bonds. It was because the mutual funds that they invested in were forced to sell the bonds. So it wasn't like the Puerto Ricans were deciding that we don't want to own Puerto Rico bonds. That happened later because the mutual funds were levered. And because they were levered, you couldn't borrow you could no longer use the bond security as collateral to lend.
Does everybody understand the concept of leverage? Should we take a minute to discuss it?
Yeah.
Okay, you take $1, you invest $1, and I'm the bank, or I'm Wells Fargo or Morgan Stanley, and you invest that $1, and depending on how you invested the $1, you can borrow against that $1 for a variety of reasons. You can borrow against the $1 because you want to take cash because you need it for some short-term need. Or you can borrow against the $1 to buy more securities. So, how many of you have a mortgage? Or have ever had a mortgage? Okay, so here's the deal. So you bought a $100,000 house, and you put up, let's say, 10 grand, and the bank gave you $90,000. And then your house is no longer worth $100,000, it's worth $80,000. And so now you have a collateral that's worth $80,000 and you owe the bank $90,000. Imagine if the bank called you and said, Juana, the debt to equity ratio is off by $10,000. Me tienes que mandar $10,000 or I'm going to take your house. Now, that doesn't happen like that. I mean, we can argue about what happened in the crisis of 2008, but it's otro cuento. That's not how it happens, but that's how it happens with liquid securities in the capital markets. You put up $100,000, you borrowed that, maybe $40,000, and then your $100,000 investment drops in value, so your collateral that's securing your loan is off, because there's always an equation. It's off. In the case of bonds, it was 60%. So if it was a $100,000 bond, you could borrow up to $60,000. Well, let's say you borrowed $50,000. Okay? You were well under the threshold. We're comfortable. The bond drops in value, goes from 100,000 to 90 to 80 to 70, and the ratio of what that collateral is protecting is off. We got the phone call. You have to put up, you're off by 5 grand or you're off by 10 grand. If you don't put up the money, I have to sell a part of your bonds to bring the equation back into Q. That went on for hundreds of millions of dollars between August, September, and October. And it got worse when the brokerage firm said, you know what? Let's just take the credit away, period. Period.
Thank you, Myrna. So now we got a little bit of perspective of what was happening here in Washington, what was happening in Puerto Rico in the capital markets at the same time. I want to now fast forward a little bit to the present, and as we know, PROMESA was enacted, and PROMESA has some very specific objectives, one of which is restructuring the debt. Javier, how does the restructuring fit into the larger puzzle of Puerto Rico's economy?
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you everyone for being here. I know it's not the lightest of topics to tackle in the morning, so I guess Yeah, I'm going to try to take a step back and not go to the granular level of it. Because I think that one thing to keep in perspective is that this is a massive restructuring. Just to add some color to what Myrna was saying, we're talking about $70 billion in bonded debt, plus $50 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. Liabilities are the amount of money that we would need to put aside in a piggy bank to make sure that all the retirement benefits that we have promised to retirees would be covered. So we're massively in debt. And if you compare that to the biggest bankruptcy before Puerto Rico, that was Detroit, it was about 18 to 20 billion. We're talking about roughly 6 times the size of that bankruptcy. So this is quite massive. And then if you go into it, you could spend a lifetime looking at every single detail. I'm sure Myrna could give you details about each flavor of debt that was issued. We have roughly 18 different issuers in Puerto Rico, and each debt is very different. It's backed by different revenue streams. You have different creditors on the table. So it's massively complex. So I'm going to try to take a step back, because sometimes I think we miss the trees for the forest. And in this case, I would say 2 things. One is that we need to weigh the pros and the cons of spending too much time in bankruptcy, which is a very expensive process. I'm sure you've all seen that the lawyers that are in this process get paid really well. And it's very expensive, so you have to weigh how long do you want to spend in this process to try to get every debt deal right. And that in itself is not a full science. A lot of it is speculative, it's political, etc. And what you do once you get out, because the problem here is that Puerto Rico is not just debt, right? Debt is just one part of the problem, but Puerto Rico also needs to have life after PROMESA and after the restructuring. And in our case, we're talking about an incredibly poor place in the United States. It's 43% poverty rate, so roughly half the population lives under the poverty line. But let's take a look sort of the macro of the debt deals. Assuming that all the deals that we have on the table, the ones that have already been hammered out, assuming that all these get approved, we're going to see a significant reduction in debt. According to the Oversight Board, which might not be the best source for everyone, but we're talking about a debt cut of roughly 28% of own revenue to debt ratio. So we were massively indebted, right? We were essentially taking a third of our revenues to pay debt service. And if all these deals get approved, we would be going down to 9%. But those are just numbers, right? So how does that compare to other places in the US? Well, the fact of the matter is Puerto Rico would actually still have one of the highest debt burdens in the country, even after restructuring. And if you pair that with the fact that Puerto Rico is also one of the poorest places in the country, you immediately have an incongruency with those 2 things that needs to be addressed. And not to go too much into detail, but I think we need to start talking too about how we address poverty. Much of the work that I do in this think tank that's behind me, and I'm sorry, I have like a mouthful of a title. But most of the work that I do is essentially, we look at, this country has safety net programs. It's had them for many years, and we can talk about Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, etc. And so what I do essentially is analyze inequities every day, because these safety net programs don't apply the same way in Puerto Rico than they do in the rest of the country. So I think the first step, right, is you need to stabilize the patient, right? We're in shock, we have an incredibly high level of poverty, so we need to have these safety net programs apply the same way that they do in the rest of the country first, so that then we can start thinking maybe about private investment, and I'm sure Myrna can talk a lot more about this. But the state is supposed to take care of the needy initially, right? And then you need economic development. So you need to start thinking about these 2 things as we move forward.
You want to react to it? I want to remind also the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, write them on a card. You have to get them on a card. So ushers should be around with extra cards if you guys need them.
They're in your bag.
Perfect.
Myrna, you want to react to it before we move on?
You want me to talk about the current restructuring?
Restructuring,
Okay, so,
One of the first was the Government Development Bank. And it went like this. I have a client with $100,000 in a bond of the Government Development Bank. And the restructuring is going to give them back 70 cents of the dollar. So they're going to get another bond that is worth $70,000. And the day, which has a 7.5% coupon and is going to mature in 2040. The next day, the bond that was worth $70,000, the second bond, is valued in the marketplace at 67% of its value. So now I've got 67% of the 70% of my original investment. So, and I actually printed out client statements to make sure I have the math correct. So $100,000 today, by the way, they went up after that. What happened was, once the deal got done, a lot of institutional investors got what they wanted, right? They bought that bond at 40 cents on the dollar. And so now they got, whatever deal they got, and so the next day there was a massive sell. Some of you can go to MSRB, those of you who like to do the research and get your hands and your head dirty with the data. You can go to the Municipal Securities Regulatory Board website. You can plug in any CUSIP number of any, and they will tell you exactly all the trades since forever of that trade. So what happened with the GDB is that the next day there's massive sell-off. People are getting out and they're selling. So the bond goes to 67% of value. It is today at 78% of value, okay? But what does that do for my $100,000 investor? The value of their investment is $38,000. And multiply that by a lot of people, right? The second deal that got done was Cofina. Now Cofina, it's interesting, and Javier and I were talking about it. Cofina was never about a bankruptcy story. Cofina was something else. Cofina was about, we have 14% or whatever it is, the sales taxes.
11.5.
11.5, thank you. We have 11.5% sales tax, and of that 11.5% sales tax, 5% went to fund these Cofina bonds. Cofina was actually born the same day or the same month as the EBU. And it's a revenue bond. So all eyes in the US municipal bond markets were watching this drama. What we were going to do to our investors was change the recitals of a deal that got done 5 or 6 years ago. And that's a no-no in the capital markets. If I lend you money, and then you come back and you change the recitals, you can bet your bottom dollar I'm not going to lend you money again. So everybody was really worried about how we were going to do this Cofina thing. Why did Cofina get on the radar? Because bondholders who own the GOs, and by the way, of the 70 billion, only 11 billion or 12 billion are GOs. Those are the only ones that are constitutionally protected. Everybody thought the full 70 billion was constitutional. No, it's only 11, it's the GOs.
Well, not anymore.
And not anymore. Pero la Constitución decía, da, right? So Cofina has this, secured revenue coming, and the GO people said, Cofina's a farce, Cofina un traqueteo, Cofina, there was a huge media blitz for months, radio, press, about Cofina's illegitimate and Cofina should go to jail and so on and so forth. And bottom line, what happened was that the trustees of the Cofina bonds, who are receiving the money and putting them into all of the tranches for their escrows to pay the principal, and the day the bonds mature, they need to have the money. The money's there, the cash is flowing, and they're about to pay the interest in June, I believe it was 2017. I can't remember if it was 16 or 17. And the trustees, with all this noise, asked Taylor Swain, bankruptcy judge, Honorable, tell us who this money belongs to. And she said, don't pay the interest yet, let me think about it. And so the June interest didn't get paid. First time. We figured it'll take her a month to think about it, it'll take her 3 months to think about it. It took 2 years to think about it. So Cofina bondholders, which are $17 billion, of which we estimate at least half were Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico investors, didn't get their interest income for 2 years on a bond that didn't go bankrupt. Bottom line, eventually, what deal got done? The deal that got done was, of the 5% that of the evil of your 11, 5% goes to this, COFINA. We're going to cut it in half. We're going to only do 2.5% going forward to COFINA, and the other 2.5 goes back to the general fund. And we pray, ¿verdad? That's supposed to help to fund the GOs. So my client with $100,000 in COFINA, there were two kinds of COFINA bonds. There were the Aníbal, Acevedo Vilá COFINA bonds, and there were the Fortunio COFINA bonds. The Aníbal COFINA bonds are called the senior, and the Fortunio bonds are called the subs, the subordinates. And if you are an investor subordinate, and by the way, again, for those of you who are research junkies, you can go to the Government Development Bank website, and there's an archive. I thought it had disappeared. I actually found it this morning. There's an archive of old stuff because the bank doesn't exist anymore. But if you go to that archive, you can actually go to any public corporation, any agency, and it will list out all of the bond issues of that agency or that corporation. So the subs came out, and their prospectus said, oh, if you buy the sub, we will pay you until it's not possible, but the seniors have precedent and preference. So if we run out of money, you don't get paid. So at the end of the deal, the translation of going to 2.5 was if you had a senior COFINA bond of your $100,000, you got $93,000 and a little bit of cash. Almost break even, but not quite. If you were a subordinate COFINA bond holder of your $100,000, you got $56,000 back. It's cut in half. And what you got, eventually there was another, it's a long story, there was another bond issue. Today everybody's got a 4.375 coupon and it matures in 2040. There are others, Javier is pointing to me, I have to go back and find out where the others are. But the conversations we had in my office with our COFINA bond holders was this one bond, okay? So now everybody's got that same bond. So you lost either 10% of your money or you lost 50% of your money. And by the way, same story happens. You paid $100,000, you got a $96,000 bond if you were a senior bond holder, and that $96,000 is not trading at $96,000, it's trading at $70,000, but it's been coming up as well. So we're recuperating from the second bond. What's got to happen to recuperate my $100,000? It's got to go to 140. Yeah.
So thank you so much for that perspective. I really want to move on because I want to get to some of the questions. We got some really good questions. PROMESA, like I said, was enacted, and when it was enacted, it was controversial. It still is controversial today. As of right now, the Committee on Natural Resources of the House and Congress is considering making changes and amendments to the law of PROMESA. At the last hearing of PROMESA in Congress, we heard many sides. And we also, without having to hear paying attention to the hearing, we know that there are also sides. There are folks that say that PROMESA should be eliminated, that should just be completely eradicated. There are folks that say that PROMESA needs some enhancements. And also, maybe the Democrats are pushing for that agenda. And then also the Republicans. We heard Rob Bishop, who used his time, instead of asking questions to the witnesses, used his time to just say, PROMESA is great. PROMESA was passed under very difficult times. Don't do anything with it. Don't reopen it. There are inherent risks on opening PROMESA right now. The Democrats are in control of the House. The Republicans are in control of the Senate, and we all know that the president is Republican, so it's not a slam dunk. Fede, as a political analyst, can you speak about the amendments that are coming to PROMESA? Try to put it as succinctly as possible, because I really want to get to some of the questions from the audience.
Well, I thought that was one of the questions. But yes, so the House Natural Resources Committee, which has jurisdiction over the U.S.'s colonies, natural parks and other things, and the territories. Yeah, that's right. Can you hear me? Okay. Ahora
Can you repeat what you just said over the last 2 hours?
Yeah, so thankfully there's a Facebook Live on my friend Lisa, so follow her on Facebook and Twitter and all that. So the House Natural Resources Committee is considering amendments to PROMESA that won't become law. It's not because I have a crystal ball like another panelist was saying earlier, it's because it's political reality. Like Eduardo said, the House is controlled by Democrats, the Republicans control the Senate, but it's a bit more complicated than that. Democrats voted for PROMESA and Republicans voted for PROMESA. Some voted against, some voted in favor. But opening that Pandora's box is uncomfortable for a lot of the people that supported PROMESA and some of the opponents of PROMESA. So there are legitimate issues with PROMESA that could be addressed in theory, like Javier wants to do. For example, audit the debt, make sure that the financing for the control board is paid not by the Puerto Rican taxpayers, which was always adding insult to injury. You're so bankrupt that we're going to put a financial oversight board on you, and you get to pay for it. So yeah, that should need fixing. What would be an ideal scenario? My personal perspective is that you need to get rid of the board, and that's done through repealing and replacing PROMESA. And what do you replace it with? People say, well, that would be irresponsible. What do you do with the debt? Elizabeth Warren and Nidia Velázquez and Bernie Sanders have a bill, sponsored by many others, that would write down Puerto Rico's debt and would actually compensate the retail bondholders in Puerto Rico, because a lot of people's life savings were lost. And so that would, and it would be a voluntary mechanism that the legislature and the government would have to apply and approve for, as opposed to PROMESA, which was imposed undemocratically on Puerto Rico. Unlike other control boards in Detroit, for example, the city monitor was imposed by the democratically elected governor of Michigan. New York City's board was imposed by the state of New York, which was elected by the people of New York. And in the case of DC, it was imposed by Congress, which we as DC residents don't get to vote for, but we do vote for the president. In the case of Puerto Rico, Congress has awarded us budgetary authority under the Commonwealth Constitution, and PROMESA basically eviscerated that level of democracy at the local level. So these things aren't just numbers and stats. It affects real people and people's democratic rights. So to answer the question, there will probably not be a bill signed into law to fix PROMESA. That bill actually would be controversial because it wouldn't just fix quote-unquote PROMESA, it would add oversight to PREPA in the form of a receiver or a syndicate. And Chairman Grijalva has also spoken about adding a federal czar to oversee the reconstruction of the funding. Adding additional layers of federal authority to Puerto Rico after what happened this summer, and after HUD and FEMA have already imposed their own federal monitors without actually spending the money in Puerto Rico, would complicate matters further. So I think that providing more transparency is key. I think that providing more community participation in how this money is spent and designed is key. And again, I go back to, unless there's economic development, the debt won't be paid down, we won't get rid of the board, and we won't balance our budgets and go back to the market, which is what PROMESA is supposed to do. You also mentioned the local investment climate and forced transactions. The FDIC forced banks in Puerto Rico to merge together, and that's been happening since 2010 when Western Bank was forced to merge with Banco Popular and other subsequent forced transactions. You mentioned Congressman Fortuño Sif, I'm sorry, former Congressman and former Governor Fortuño, now lobbyist. He passed a law that forced cooperatives, credit unions in Puerto Rico to buy Puerto Rican bonds that later obviously weren't paid back. And so that also affected individual Puerto Rican savings and the financial health of the island. And another cause of PROMESA, which gets lost, and I'll also refer you to a documentary on Frontline PBS, the predatory lending by Wall Street. Yes, politicians in Puerto Rico were responsible over borrowing and overspending, but there were investment houses and credit rating agencies in Wall Street that basically pressured the government of Puerto Rico and said, if you don't buy these bonds, which actually are underwritten by the Santanders and the UES and the institutional folks in Wall Street, then we'll downgrade your credit rating. And so they put the Puerto Rican government, entre la espada y la pared. So all of those factors went into play. And again, if you don't provide more power to Puerto Rico to control its economy, to grow its economy, democratize the process by getting rid of the board, having a way to compensate bondholders in the island, but also writing down the debt to a sustainable way, this problem won't be solved. And we throw these words around, COFINA, GOs, and all that, but what that actually means is that these debt restructuring agreements are unsustainable. They were backed by the sales tax in the case of COFINA, they were backed by what ratepayers pay for the electricity rates in Puerto Rico for the PREPA restructuring, but now they're supersized. Now people will have to pay a lot more for the debt, and they're not just backed by what ratepayers pay or what the sales tax finances. They're actually now backed in part by the government of Puerto Rico general bonds and general revenues, I'm sorry. So they're actually getting a more sweetheart deal after the hurricane than they were before. And to mention a word you used in the inequities of how things run in Puerto Rico, government contractors are still owed money by the government of Puerto Rico. They're not getting paid. And under the agreements that have been made, an average government contractor will get back 2 cents on the dollar for what the government owed for services that they're owed, while COFINA senior bondholders will probably get 90 cents on the dollar. And without economic growth, again, how are you going to pay these debt deals? Under the board's own numbers, these debt deals are unsustainable. And I encourage you to see Alvin Velasquez from SEIU's testimony in the House PROMESA hearings, where he said basically, we're going to have to be back here between 3 and 5 years to restructure the debt again. I don't think that that's what Congress intended. I don't think that's what the Puerto Ricans in the island or in the mainland deserve. And the bondholders in the U.S. also deserve more certainty, right? Because there are also mom and pop investors in the U.S., not just hedge funds, that invested in Puerto Rican bonds and will have to go back to the market. So actually being so generous to Wall Street will actually impact American bondholders and investors as well that aren't necessarily your Wall Street types, but they invested their savings in mutual funds as well as people in the island. So this is very complicated, and basically the answer is we need economic development tools, we need more sustainable debt restructuring agreements, and Puerto Rico needs to get its democracy back.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer. Some time there. I want to go back to the decisions of the board and other things that can be done in Puerto Rico. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to summarize them about economic development. It's not all about the debt, but there are other things that can be done. Even PROMESA has a chapter dedicated to economic development. Javier, can you please speak about what can be done and how does the future look like?
Well, I'm going to try. I don't have the answers to everything, but I think just a little color on COFINA. I know that you had talked about this, but just so you have a sense of perspective, the entirety of the COFINA debt was issued in 5 years, from 2007 to 2011. We issued about $18 billion in bond in just 5 years. This country could do for Puerto Rico. I think you need to address poverty because, again, it's about stabilizing the patient first. And that's not going to be a panacea, right? Like, if we extend better Medicaid benefits for Puerto Rico, if we get them other anti-poverty tools, I'm not going to, stand here and tell you that's the solution to every problem, but it's a start in the right direction. So, for example, there's other things like earned income tax credit, which are preeminent anti-poverty tools that have existed in this country since the mid-70s, that in Puerto Rico, right, existed for a little bit only at a local level, and Congress has done nothing to support these things. And those go straight to the heart of many of Puerto Rico's problems, which are not poverty, but also a dysfunctional economy where we have a huge informal market. So there are tools, there are safety nets, but in Puerto Rico, rather tragically, they don't apply the same way. They apply in a very unequal way, so I think that's much of a start. And then on the private side, I think I'm going to hand it over to Myrna, because I think she might have some ideas of what could happen there.
Okay, so I'm speaking to the 35 to 55-year-old Puerto Ricans and other friends of the family. Those of us over 55 are atrophied because we've lost between the bond story and the stocks of the local banks and all of that. We've lost $80 billion. We're not interested in investing in Puerto Rico. But there's this age range of 35 to 55. Doesn't want to leave. But thank God is saying, you've got to stay here. This is my country. What do we do? First of all, as a backdrop, just so you know, just that Puerto Rico is a $1 billion economy. It's larger than, how many? 20 some odd states in the United States. Okay? It's a $1 billion economy. Nama. But it's bigger than
Sorry to interrupt, but isn't the general fund budget $9 billion? How can the economy just be $1 billion?
It's a $1 billion economy. But we're thinking that it's a negative economy. Something is happening and something is going on. Let me walk you through what I think are Puerto Rico's low-hanging fruit, because I always like to finish up saying that the glass is half full. We have a legacy in biopharma and medical devices in Puerto Rico, second to none in the world. And we can build on that. I've had general managers of companies or managers of companies come to me because they're trying to build a way to buy the company because they're going to leave Barcelona or wherever, and they'd like to take it over. There's an extraordinary capacity of human capital, thanks to the University of Puerto Rico, by the way, for biopharma and medical devices. There are manufacturing clusters, as in Aguadilla, and I'm not going to, I think you can talk to Eduardo somewhat, he can speak to this much better than I can, but what's happening in Aguadilla is like another country. And it's creating a core business, in this case it's around aerospace, and all of the cluster collateral companies that are evolving around that are all Puerto Rican companies. Research that's coming from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and Puerto Rico's Colegio de Ciencias Médicas, that are yielding patents, and we're losing the patents and the financial benefit of the patents because we don't know how to get them commercialized. Yeah. And that's a functional problem inside of the University of Puerto Rico. Information technology and communication solutions are being developed and springing up in Puerto Rico's incubators, a fast developing incubator cluster network that's going on in Puerto Rico, Parallel 18, Grupo Guayacán, Colmena 66, you can look them up on the web. They're fabulous. Agro-industry, Semillero Ventures, where there are young professionals. La Escuela de Agronomía in Mayagüez has registrations again, whereas for a very long time they didn't. But there's a capacity potentially to reverse the import-export relationship with food in Puerto Rico. Private investments locally. Puerto Rico has an investable universe between $35 and $40 billion in assets. But the trustees are boomers and we're not looking at Puerto Rico. But the money is there. But we have been able to raise about $300 million of local money to invest with local investment funds. I've been working personally on this for 10 years to create the private equity and private debt ecosystem in Puerto Rico. We need $6 billion, we're at $300 million. We need $1 billion because $6 billion, will get us to the 300,000 jobs that we need, which through tax receipts is going to go to the Treasury and help us to deal with the whole topic of debt and other things that we want to reinvest that money in. Culture, history, and tourism, and many of you have heard me say this before, all of the reasons to visit a place in the middle of the ocean that owns the sun and the wind, where every major empire in the history of the world deposited DNA. Yes. Check it out. It's all about our agriculture, it's about the music, it's about the food, it's about hanging out in Puerto Rico with extraordinarily diverse backgrounds. If you go to Ponce, it's French. If you go to Old San Juan, it's Andalusian. Y por ahí para abajo. It's an extraordinary place to visit. Of course, the natural resources in Puerto Rico unto itself is a reason to visit. Think about, why do you go to Vienna, those of you who travel? Why do you go to New York? Why do you go to Chicago? Why do you go to Berlin? And how do you know you're in Berlin versus New York? Think about that. Because that's what's going to, when everybody, by the way, is in t-shirts and blue jeans. I just came back from Istanbul, and everybody was in t-shirts and blue jeans. So how do you know you're in Istanbul and you're not in someone? And why would you want to go to someone? Global financial services. Puerto Rico is, in fact, an international financial services hub. The Puerto Ricans don't know it because it's based on international banking entities, international financial entities. There are 81 international financial and banking entities in Puerto Rico. There are over 200 international insurance companies in Puerto Rico. And so somebody's getting serviced out of Puerto Rico because this is all based on laws where you export your services. Higher education. I see some of my friends from Lehman here. There are 20 private accredited universities in Puerto Rico, in addition to the University of Puerto Rico. The UPR boasts top-ranking engineering, medical, business, and law schools in the United States. It's a bilingual and online teaching higher education. Why would you want to go study in Puerto Rico? Se acabó el tiempo. And the energy recap, which my friends in the previous panel so happily.
Point of parliamentary inquiry, no, I'm just kidding. Just to clarify, according to the World Bank, the GDP of Puerto Rico was 105 billion in 2016, so this is an educational thing, so I just wanted to clarify.
Well, I want to thank you all for being flexible with us, extending us a little bit beyond time. I have a couple of things I do want to say. You heard Javier talk about the current income tax credit. He just published an article this past week about earned income tax credit. I encourage you to just Google EITC, and you can put his name, Balmaceda, and it will come up. So the other part I wanted to tell you is we also received a lot of questions. We did not get to all of them. This is usual, this is common, but please do come and talk to us after the panel. That's part of the summit. The summit does not end right now.